Right?
Are you for real?
I know.
Here we are just on the tails of part 1, and now we come out with part 2 today.
Part 2.
Powerful 5-part series on the topic of Black History Month.
Yeah.
Slavery.
Slavery in America.
Lot to take on, right?
Yeah, it's a lot.
But I think you're going to find it valuable, so we hope that you'll enjoy it. We hope that you'll like it. You'll comment. Please do get involved in the comment section. Give us your thoughts. Give us your insights. Give us your feelings and your emotions. And let's share this video.
Yeah,
friends and family
please.
members. If you're a parent, I want to encourage you. There are some tough things to digest, but share with them, watch it with them, and then maybe dialogue with them about it at the level that's appropriate for them.
Absolutely. And if you haven't had a chance, please subscribe to our channel. If you love our videos, I know you're going to love all of them. And definitely we appreciate your love and support in that. So please be sure to stop by, subscribe, hit the bell, and enjoy part 2.
But the North is prospering off of slavery as well.
Yeah.
Right? They've got industry beginning to burst in the North, which were taking and processing cotton and tobacco and all those different elements that are being produced in the South. So let's run over a little bit over the myth that there was just the society we lived in was a Southern racist world in contrast to the North experiencing it all.
Yeah, so that's definitely a huge misconception. The reality is a lot of Northerners were just as racist as Southerners. And they were just as much in support of slavery as the Southerners were. The truth is Northerners benefited off slavery. Mm-hmm. They absolutely did. And so a lot of them didn't want, for economic reasons, didn't necessarily want slavery to end either because they profited from it.
Mm-hmm. And so that fight for capitalism, the almighty dollar, right, ruled the moral conscience of our society for a great number of years. And many debate whether it's still running the consciousness of our society.
Right,
as well.
You know, as you deal with the northern states didn't have, plantations like the South did. So while the Northerners didn't necessarily own slaves because it didn't really necessarily make sense with the way of life in the North, it definitely was something that they wanted to keep going in the South. Absolutely.
And so here we have this northern push, some Southerners pushing for the abolitionists.
Yeah.
Rising up, fighting against slavery.
Right.
And a lot of people think that when the end of Civil War, right, slavery came to an abrupt halt.
Yep.
Cease and dismiss.
Yeah.
That it was over. That African Americans went free.
Yeah.
Some of them drifted around the South for a while and ended up in Detroit.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
So tell a little bit about was that the end of the Civil War? Is that the end of slavery?
Yeah, no.
Okay.
No. So one of the misconceptions people have in the mindsets is, once slavery ended, why couldn't people just pull themselves up, or black people, I should say, why couldn't they just pull themselves up and just move on past slavery? We'll have an explanation for that. It's called 150 years of discriminatory behavior and treatment against black people.
Tell it.
And that is the truth. While slavery was 400 years ago, and it ended after 250 years, we still have 150 years of oppression against black people. I mean, you have, freed slaves were not allowed to own land. So that's something that people need to understand. Generational wealth is enormously important to economic growth. And that is something that black people do not have an abundance of.
For years they didn't have access to any of it
at all.
Right? So in many states, many regions of our country, it was absolutely illegal for an African American
they could
to
not own land. Yes.
So, and in the places where it was legal, right, places like Tulsa,
right,
we see
we saw what happened there,
right. Which I encourage you to actually watch that film, the 1911,
1919 or 1918, summer of 1918.
Yeah, and it will open your eyes to some realities of what America has truly gone through in their metamorphosis.
Yeah.
However, the ability to be free, to own land, to establish your economic well-being, to develop and mature that way, now that's what we would consider freedom, right? The ability to be free from obligation to other people because you've achieved a certain degree of economic wealth.
Right. So, I mean, if you think about free slaves were not allowed to own land. They had to deal with sharecropping, segregation, Jim Crow laws, disproportionate education and health care. opportunities, mass incarcerations, police violence. This all became an acceptable form of treatment to white supremacists, and it became a societal norm. This treatment of black people became completely normalized within our society and acceptable.
And it went from being overt
Yeah.
to a very covert heartbeat
Yes.
all over not only the South, but throughout the North.
Right.
As we expanded westward, it came with us, right? The mindset, the policies, and the way that you govern it began to unfold all across the country. So it almost took slavery from a place where it was isolated to a place where it was the dominant culture of our entire society and all of our society, from housing to medical to political influence to education. It began to corrupt all of those institutions with the mindset that the African American was naturally inferior.
Absolutely.
Right? And so it began to terrorize our mindset. It began to terrorize really the soul of America. And so now we get to a place where we believe, and there's this driving concept that the classroom history taught in our classroom has given us everything that we need to know about slavery.
So definitely a big misconception on that, tremendously. And, I encourage you as our viewers to please comment below. Tell us about your history of what you learned in school, what you were taught about slavery, what that meant to you, especially in comparison to some of the things that we're talking about in this video. I would definitely love to hear that. I know how much that affected my understanding of slavery and how I felt about slavery.
Well, it's kind of interesting, people talk a lot about, and I happen to be very fortunate. I was a very popular kid in school because I was an athlete, right? And it was kind of my golden ticket. But you would see all around the school an emphasis and a rise of the population or the popularity of the 6 or 7 African American kids in my school during February, right? Yeah. Anytime that we were forced to watch Roots, right? You'd get these random hugs from people you never heard about, you never knew, right?
For sure.
And so awareness is a powerful thing. However, it's so limited and so shallow in the way that we teach it that it's almost a pity thing that then it's swept away.
It is, because, again, the reason why is because it is something that we don't feel. Like, we don't understand the pain and suffering and the emotions behind it. And everything is just talked about at a very sub-level. Nothing,
very shallow.
Yes, very shallow. And, it's not... There's no deep diving into the truth of it and where it comes from. We watch Roots. We all cry. We feel sad, for Kunta Kinte. And, we feel sad about that.
His name ain't Toby, damn it.
Right. So, but that's about the extent of it. We're taught this is what happened, but it's all matter of fact. It's this, it's that, and then we just kind of move past it.
Sure.
So we don't ever feel anything about the true history. So that's why, and I have to say, please forgive us and our ignorance, because the truth is, when we say, hey, slavery was over 400 years ago, like, why are you still mad? Why are you still angry? I didn't enslave you.
Sure.
Like, where is, you just need to get past it. You need to move past it. And we say that because we don't understand what we actually did to slaves, to black people, and the horrific life for hundreds of years that was endured at our hands.
And when you say what we did, I don't think it's just a white thing that we did. I think it's also a societal thing that we did.
Yes.
And there are definitely those that were free African Americans in the North who maybe weren't willing to lay down their lives for that cause. Now, there were many abolitionists that fought against slavery, and there's been a tremendous amount of people who have been among the woke society, right? There's been tremendous amount of people who have given their lives for civil rights and equality, and whether it's a fight for equality in racial issues, or whether it's a fight for it in the area of sexism and so forth. I think that those are important battles to fight.
Yeah.
But we certainly didn't go deep enough into the psychology of what happened and the scarring that happened to really move to a place of healing. I think it's one thing to you have 2 kids, right? and the one kid pushes down the other child, right? It's one thing to force them to go say, I'm sorry. It's another one to explain to them why that's wrong.
Right.
Why that's going to affect them beyond just this moment.
Yeah.
And I get that there's some age appropriateness to
Right,
that, right?
right.
I can't give my 2-year-old the same psychological process that I give my 9-year-old, right?
Yeah.
If my 2-year-old pushes down my 4-year-old, right? I say, hey, that's not how we treat each other. We treat each other with love. We embrace each other. Here's why. You don't want him to push you, do you? You don't deserve to be pushed. But when I address it with my 9-year-old, I begin to expand beyond. If you push him down, do you think that he's going to feel good about himself? Do you think that he's going to have a willingness to allow others to push him down on the playground? So we begin to expand that understanding that your abuse of the one that you love or is closest to you makes them subject to being abused by others.
Yeah.
And so we expand that reality.
Right.
And so I say that to say that in our education of Black history, oftentimes all we've done is given permission for the abuse to continue.
Yes.
Right? We've said, oh, it's so bad what those slave owners did. But we've not expressed it beyond the ownership of those slaves.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
The prosperity of those who have been blessed and made fortunate because of it. Those who continue to prosper on it or prospered on it then.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to realize, too, that schools really only teach partial truths.
Yeah.
And that's just the reality. And, however, the South was very clear on how they wanted history taught. And of course, it predominantly put white slave owners in a positive light.
Sure.
That they were good people. They were taking care of poor, inferior Black slaves who just needed to be taken care
And
of.
of course, it was a way of our society.
Yeah,
but if they didn't have the money
absolutely.
through slavery, they wouldn't be able to help.
Right. And the truth is, white supremacists were integrated and famous great leaders in our country. And that is pushed at a far higher extreme level in our history than the truth of slavery and what those white supremacists, their involvement in that. I mean, look, 12 out of our first 18 presidents in the United States of America were all slave owners.
Right.
How many times do we hear those stories?
Not
How
at all.
often do we talk about these presidents who are running our country? They're slaves. Or the fact that they had children with a lot of their slaves. I mean, Thomas Jefferson, oh my gosh, he had a full-on relationship with one of his slaves and multiple children. And, but these are things that nobody focuses on. They might be mentioned maybe, but then it's moved on to another topic. And I think that
it's addressed in isn't this interesting?
Right.
And then let's move on. And so it wasn't widespread.
Right.
No, it was widespread. What Jefferson did was a widespread. He was fortunate enough to be able to build an internal home for them inside of his home. And it was a secret space. And so forth and so on. But what he did, every slave owner, not every slave owner, but a high majority of slave owners were doing it one level or another in that within the context of that society, right?
Absolutely. So, I think it's just really something that needs to be addressed. The fact that look at the history that we are taught compared to the history that we haven't been taught. I mean, there were so many Black abolitionists that weren't even mentioned in our history. And those are things that should be talked about. They're important to our history.
Right. And here we have around the world, people would make this argument, well, slavery still exists today. Right?
It doesn't exist today?
No, they would say, well, slavery in some form or another still exists today.
Okay.
They would argue that in Africa or these Muslim countries, that's why we're anti-Muslim and so forth, right? Where they would make these arguments. But the reality is slavery never really ended in our country. Or did it? I mean, we have this myth that slavery ended and it doesn't exist today within our context. So unfold that a little bit, because I think it's important that we don't point to slavery afar off in some country whose slavery doesn't look or feel at all like what American slavery felt like or was institutionalized as. Talk about slavery existing today in America.
Yeah, so the idea that slavery doesn't exist anymore, people, when they think of slavery, they of course think plantations, picking cotton, field workers, that's the idea of slavery, right? So when we look around today, we don't see plantations, we don't see Black people picking cotton in fields, we don't see that normal idea of slavery. So in our minds, it doesn't exist. But I have two words for you: mass incarceration.
Well, tell it.
Yeah, free prison labor people.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
Three strikes and you're out.
3 strikes and you're out. So it's really important to understand this, because by the late 1860s through the 1920s, over 90% of the prison and jail population in the South were all black. Thousands of men, women, and children were hired out by the states to private factories and farms for free. From sunup to sundown, they were forced to work. Often suffering horrible treatment from what they called the whipping bosses, who flogged, mauled, and murdered them without any consequences. I mean, they were exploited, denied basic human rights, dignities, the right to citizenship. Families were separated, and violent punishments for refusing to work for them, or to just needing to sit down and take a break. I mean, it's appalling, absolutely appalling to me that this continued after slaves were freed, right? That there's no more slavery. But people, there is such a thing as modern day slavery. Just because it is not in your face, boom, smack you in the face, does not mean it does not exist. There is so many different forms. And even if you go back into from the 1920s, prison labor still continues in 2021.
Yeah.
Okay. There's some statistics I'll read to you later when we bring this topic back up, about what that looks like today in the 21st century, but it is still happening. And this is the systemic racism continued slavery. It was intentional. It was systematically designed that way because people never wanted to give up being a slave society.
Yeah, and you look at it today, we have a world where we call from the educational system.
Yeah.
From the school to the prison pipeline, right? And it's important that we, as those who would want to make a difference, we want to make a difference for our children's lives, that we begin to educate ourselves, that we stop waiting on a society that is not only whitewashed, but hidden the truth.
Yeah.
Not only for a whitewash benefit, but from a guilt standpoint, just hidden from the truth. We're a society whose mom basically covers up the reality that daddy was beating them for years and years and years. And I say that tongue-in-cheek a little bit because I think domestic violence is a video that deserves its own attention.
Yeah, for sure.
But it's very much in that same vein that we are a society whose family has beaten one another nearly to death and stayed silent about it, right?
Absolutely.
And there's this whole dialogue that we need to fix what's broken, right? You hear it all the time. The prison system is broken. We hear it all the time. Racism is a broken mind. Racism is a mental disease. Racism is broken. But when you really think about the way that America was founded, when you really start to think about the truth of our society, nothing was broken at all, right? Nothing is broken right now about it at all.
Nope.
The truth is American history, right? Where we are in black history and slavery was built this way.
Yeah, the truth is America was founded on white supremacy. Now, that's an ugly word, right? And a lot of people don't like that term. But the truth is that is the founding of America. That is our history. And it has become very problematic in the 21st century. And we have seen...
Very uncomfortable.
Yeah, we have seen recently what that has looked like. And, something that our country was founded on is continuing today.
Right. And you wrote some stats. I mean, 20% of the African American community has a percentage of Caucasian.
Right.
Well, the same is true of the white community.
Right.
For the very first time in American history, I think it's by 2030, I believe the statistic is, we will be, for the first time, whites will be the minority. In our society. Right? And so we are a changing demographic. However, the foundation of our country has dictated that up to this point we have scratched and clawed and been deceptive and tried to deceive and tried to lie and tried to manipulate to keep white supremacy as the ruling dominant force of our country. Right?
Yeah, and I mean, we still see that in today, and we see it within politics, within our government, in our state governments. We see that today, that even though the percentage of white supremacists that quote unquote still exist are still the dominant force controlling how this country runs.
Yeah.
Now, look, we talked about the difference, that there's a difference between a slave society and a society with slaves. And
Sure.
Slavery was the basis of white supremacy, which united all whites in a racist hierarchy.
So powerful.
Now, that is really important because that is how this country was built, on a racist white hierarchy. Now, laws were passed to further dehumanize black slaves and to further the white slave owners' control over them, even allowing them to kill a slave with no consequence. Just to put something in perspective, right, because we don't often think about this, but 40 out of the 56 signatures on the Declaration of Independence, 40 of the men who signed that were all slave owners. 40.
It's mind-boggling.
Again, we don't think about our founding forefathers in the light that they were slave owners. We don't, for some reason, we know that they were, because it was briefly talked about, but we don't actually think about it when we think about these people, these men, right? That's, I mean, look, they came up with the three-fifths rule, and honestly, I'm not going to lie, I had no idea what that was until Richard explained it to me, and I was just astounded. And not just at my lack of understanding, but what people's actual understanding of what that meant.
Sure.
And why don't you tell people what that meant, Richard?
Well, I think that it's powerful to be in a place where you say, you had to own a certain number of slaves for this to even qualify you.
Right.
Because if you didn't own a certain amount of slaves, they weren't human, period.
Yes.
However, it was all about voting capacity and
Yes.
ability to manipulate the vote. It's funny how we still are arguing the same facts today.
Right. Voter suppression.
Voter suppression. You talk about the fight right now going on in Congress and Senate, and the madness of voter suppression that's trying to be legislated
be passed,
right now in our country, which is, they're trying to set us back another 100 years.
Right.
I mean, it's absolutely asinine, and we're thrilled and we're happy that there's a change in the head of the White House. We seem happy and content that the Senate is fighting over whether or not to give us $1,400 or not. Yeah. But $1,400, they're saying that a slave was worth $55,000. So my question is if our vote is suppressed again, right, which is what the three-fifths law is all about, saying that the African American was only worth 3/5 of a human person, right?
Yeah.
That three of them, 5 slaves, right? You had to have 5 to have 3 votes, right?
Right.
That if we allow them to take the vote from us, really what they're taking from us, and maybe not to the full extent of outright slavery, is they're taking $55,000 from every single human life, right? Every African American life, because what they're saying is that our value to them is, as contributors, we aren't fully human. Right. Therefore, we are still property. Therefore, our vote should not be equal in the sight of swaying the popular vote. Yeah. Right? And so when you look at that and you study it and you begin to realize that they treat us, not cattle.
Shadow.
But they treated us like shadow.
They called you shadow.
They moved us just along the board like sheep.
Yep. To
use us as their pawns, and the richest slave owners were able to get a majority of votes, right, to sway how politics worked.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's happening right now.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
It might not be happening in the same sense of outright saying that the African American life is not worth as much. But anytime you take a voter box and you say, hey, we're going to move it from this community to far off community 20 miles away where we make it difficult for them to vote, we're saying that their vote matters less to us. As a matter of fact, it matters against us. Therefore, the system has to be rigged so that we don't give the people what they want.
Right, 100%. Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that it's really important to understand how these all correlate with our history, with our present. Because, what is the old saying, learn from your past, right?
Sure.
But you can't learn from a past you don't know about.
And when you look at it, it's a form of terrorism.
Oh my
right?
gosh.
And America has a
absolutely.
long-lasting fascination and appreciation for terrorism, right?
I-
Long before 9/11,
Right.
which never forget.
Yeah.
We swear we'll never forget that one. But let's run through the list of some of the terrorism that has been committed against the African American people.
You know, it's funny because we always hear the narrative how violent the black communities are and black people and whatnot. But the truth is, white people have a history of domestic terrorism in this country. They have a history of violence against black people in this country. I mean, as you said, before we had 9/11, we had the Oklahoma City bombing. I mean, a white man did that,
Sure.
you know, who had ties to white supremacy. You know, we have the Tulsa Race Massacre from 1921, where, I mean, that was horrific. Again, perpetrated by white people, white supremacists against African Americans. So, you know, and this, of course, is followed by multiple bombings by white people on black people's homes. I mean, Martin Luther King Jr. had his house bombed multiple times. Beatings of black peoples in their homes, outside their
Sure.
homes, walking down the streets, their communities and people. I mean, white people have a history of violence against black people.
Most recently, on attack on the Capitol.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so, you know, you have to look at it and you have to begin to say, well, where is the voice for change, right?
Yeah.
Not too long ago, they always tell us, well, this isn't the appropriate way to express disappreciation for the way things have been, right? It's not appropriate for us to march.
Yeah.
It's not appropriate for us to fight. It's not appropriate for us to have looting or rioting or whatever. And certainly some of those things are very true. It's not appropriate.
Right.
But apparently it's also not appropriate for us to kneel.
Yeah.
It's not appropriate for us to sit. It's not appropriate for us to gather together and cry, right? And so the question becomes, what is the appropriate way? We look at the Start-Spangled Banner,
Yeah.
Colin Kaepernick, for instance.
Yes.
And you have a whole society that was torn apart or torn over the topic, right? Viewership in the NFL plummeted
Right.
as a
Oh.
result of it, right?
The hate.
The
just
hate
spewing
that
from people.
gathered around it. I remember still being in a gym in Everett, and when Colin first refused to stand during the national anthem, just all hell breaking out.
Oh my
I mean,
gosh.
you know, grown men fighting on the basketball court
Yeah.
over whether or not he had the right to
Yeah.
kneel. But what most people don't realize that there is a whole stanza that we don't, of course, sing today,
Yeah.
right? But the song itself was founded in it. Share that a little bit, because I think it's important for Americans and our viewing audience to begin to understand that just because we see things at one perspective
Yep.
doesn't mean that there isn't a much broader, deeper, wider breadth of understanding to that topic, that if we investigate it, we begin to say, you know what, the lights come on a little bit.
Yep.
I can see from a new perspective, and when you can see from a new perspective, the truth of history begins to change. So roll that out a little
Right.
bit.
So let's talk about the Star-Spangled Banner for a second. The author, Francis Scott Key, was an avowed white supremacist. Imagine that. He was...
Whew, what a part that was right there.
Yeah.
Part 2 wasn't no joke.
It wasn't.
It was serious on my heart, on my soul. There was a lot we went through. I hope you liked it. I hope you had a chance to comment on some of the thoughts that you had,
Yeah.
some questions that you had, some, Richard, we call BS on that. Whatever your position is, let's get it out there. And I want to encourage you, start sharing this with your friends and your family members.
Yeah.
Maybe you have a younger child at home or a sibling. Share it with them as well and dialogue with it at their level.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, the more we get truth out there, the more we can make changes and make some differences in this country that we desperately need to do right now. So, you know, please definitely take a minute, if you haven't already, subscribe to our channel. You know, we definitely value and appreciate you,
We certainly
and you know, appreciate you being part of our community. Make sure you stick around for part 3, because it's going to be a doozy as well.